Finally, has David finally conquered Goliath? Today we're going to talk about the KZ Krila. KZ seems to think that their latest cheapie IEM is capable of beating an IEM worth of about $1,000. But honestly, every time somebody mentions KZ, it just gives me PTSD of the times where KZ did strange shenanigans, like having IEMs with drivers that isn't really connected or barely even making sound. But those are things of the past with the brand new Krila, where KZ claims that it can beat a kilobuck IEM. So let's just start with unboxing. Unboxing KZ IEMs has never been an occasion. It is an extremely mundane experience with little to no surprises, and this isn't an exception to the formula. At the front of the box, you get an image of the IEM plastered in the center with some bits of literature at the bottom. Apparently, Krila means wings of freedom. I'm not sure what does that mean, but I'm just basically translating the Chinese name. An interesting point is that at the back of the box, it has a frequency band of 20 Hz to 40,000 kHz, which is a lot, mind you. Opening it, you just see the IEM sitting in its plastic cradle, and below that is just the included cable as well as 3 pairs of KZ Starline ear tips. It's quite nice of KZ to include some foamies as well, which isn't common these days. Also included in the box is a SIM card ejector pin for those of you who want to mess with the switches that is located on the IEM. So really, there isn't too much to talk about, really. It is serviceable, but the box has not much flair, and I cannot really fault it as, well, these are sub $20. It's really affordable, and KZ is really hell-bent on beating IEMs costing more than $1,000, so perhaps we can cut them some slack. Build quality, this is where I must applaud KZ. They have successfully leveled up their build quality from that of an e-waste plastic to something much more substantial. It still has that custom universal shape with half of the chassis being made of a smoky plastic that allows you to see the inner workings of the IEM. The faceplate section of the IEM is made from metal, and that is actually finished to a rather smooth, nice polished metallic grey colour. They look rather sleek and definitely better than their previous plastic offerings. I like the wings that is kind of like the motif on the front. They say that they are wings, but yeah. This is a hybrid design that features a 10mm second generation Jin driver and a balance armature. You can actually see the dynamic driver quite obviously, while the balance armature is hidden in the nozzle. On the chassis is a 4-way switch that allows you to adjust the sound somewhat. I never really like switches, but for the curious tinkerers out here, this can actually be quite fun for you. One thing to note is that the switches are inverted on the left and the right, so you have to make sure that you have the right orientation before making adjustments for the sound to sound balanced. Personally, I rather have a well-tuned IEM out of the box rather than to fiddle around with switches. It also comes in an interchangeable 2-pin configuration, which is nice. Cable is made from some silver-plated copper that is terminated to a 3.5mm jack. The cable is quite tangly, but microphonics is capped to a minimum. There isn't a chin stop here, which I would have liked so that I can keep the IEMs feeling a little bit more secure when I'm using them. Next, let's talk about comfort. Comfort is pretty much in line with other custom universal models out there. It is generally pretty good with zero hotspots for me. So the shells remain quite light and inconspicuous. Oh yes, the Krila is a vented IEM, which is great as it reduces pressure buildup in your ears. Sound. I personally use the Lotu-Por S2 and Pogo Touch Titanium when testing the Krila. The Krila is rather easy to drive on my dongle, but they certainly do sound better with a bit more power. I give kudos to KZ for managing to create quite a technical sounding IEM, especially at this price point being sub $20. I think that it does well when it comes to technicalities. You actually can get quite decent detailing and rather good separation in this price bracket. This is a very mild V-shaped IEM that can be rather genre fluid, quite different from the extreme Vs of old. When it comes to tone, these are a balanced armature sounding IEM, but I personally would have liked it to have a bit more detail. The switches here do augment the curves somewhat, but I never found that it affects tone of the IEM all that much, so I'm not really going to talk about it. It just affects it a little bit, so Yeah, I don't really bother with it, to be honest. Bass. The Krila renders bass in a rather fast manner that has good emphasis on the sub-bass that tapers into mid-bass quite quickly. You get to hear pretty decent sub-bass rumble with adequately fast decay. Mid-bass quantity is well controlled, and as such, you do not get much exaggerated bloat, which keeps it rather neat and tidy. For the price, bass rendering is actually pretty decent. I do not find them to be very dynamic though, it just seems to cap out at a certain level. Next, mid-range. Tonal weight of the mid-range, it's slightly thinner than the popular natural warm seen in many of recent other IEM brand releases. I don't particularly enjoy male vocals on the Krila. It does come across as a little too thin to really showcase the gravitas and power of male vocals. I just wish for it to have a little bit more power to male vocals. For female vocals, it does fare better as they do sound dainty, focused, and have a little bit better performance in the upper mid-range. They do sound a little bit grainy, fuzzy in the mid-range though. Instruments here are quite clear, but they are rendered in a manner where it is quite 2D sounding. Treble extension on this $20 IEM, it's pretty adequate and quite good. For some folks it can be a little bit harsh, but I found them to be decent. Agents of sibilants, cymbals and crashes sizzle and fade quite quickly and isn't too annoying. I do find them to be slightly airy as well. Soundstage. When it comes to width and height, the Krila sounds wide but not particularly tall. This probably has something to do with the lack of dynamics in the bass department, where the lack of dynamics can cause this perception. Depth and positioning. I do not get much depth with the Krila. It seems pretty 2D to me on a flat plane. Positioning is also just okay as the graininess in the mid-range fuzzes up positioning somewhat. And next, I'm going to compare it with some earphones. Let's give the KZ an easy one to begin with first, versus the Tangzu Waner. Now the Krila has better build quality than the Waner. The metal faceplate just feels more solid and substantial by comparison. The Waner has a more traditional V shape, which allows it to be a bit more dynamic sounding and thus can be a little bit more exciting to listen to. It is also less fuzzy in the mid-range, although the Waner isn't as technically competent when it comes to fine details. The Krila sounds better technically, but a little less fun by comparison. Versus the Simgot EW100p. Now the Simgot EW100p is clearly made from plastic completely. I think if you were to do a hammer test, the Krila will come out just ahead of the EW100p. But in terms of shell design, I do feel that the EW100p has a better design language and less generic like the Krila. When it comes to sound, the Simgot EW100p has bass with more quantity, and that is equally as taut as the Krila. I do find that the EW100p to sound less fuzzy in the mid-range, making vocals clearer and more enticing to listen to. The Simgot EW100p does sound more refined, while the KZ is a little more raw sounding. And lastly, versus the final A5000. So KZ says that the Krila actually competes with 1000 USD IEMs. I think that this is quite a stretch, so I'm going to give it a fighting chance by comparing with USD $279 pair of final A5000. I mean, KZ did claim that the Krila is a kilobuck beater, so it should easily smoke the A5000. But does it? It's nice that KZ actually used a metal faceplate, but I think that the design of the final A5000 is more unique and identifiable despite it being plastic. I also do respect originality, so for me, I prefer the A5000 over the KZ when it comes to design. When it comes to sound, the A5000 graph quite similarly to the KZ, but when it comes to tone, the Krila, it's out of its depth by comparison. The A5000 just sounds more cohesive with details that is more defined than the Krila. The A5000 bass is also tighter, faster and more dynamic by comparison. Mid-range of the A5000 is also crystal clear compared to the slightly fuzzy nature of the KZ. Treble is also more natural on the A5000. Basically, the A5000 outclasses the Krila. You might say that this isn't a fair fight. That's true. But KZ markets it to be, well, better than a $1000 USD IEM, which it clearly isn't. I did not set this rule for comparison, they set it themselves. But with that said, is the Krila good? I'd say yes, it actually does compete in terms of technicalities with IEMs that cost slightly above its price point, but I do feel that when it comes to tone, it does sound a little sterile. But really, this is a good attempt from KZ, a pretty decent effort for folks who are looking for a good pair of technical IEM at an extremely cheap price point. With that said, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Super Chong Super Audio Show. If you like the program so far, please kindly press the like and subscribe button somewhere down below. It will help me out a whole bunch. Yeah, I just got back on my trip. I'm working on a major video that will be out quite soon. It's taking a bit of time for me to do that, but I'm very excited I managed to do this video. Please watch out for it. It should be out quite soon. Maybe not the next two. I need a bit more time than that, but you know. With that said, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope to see you guys soon.